Marco,
Sean,
you know where I wasn't?
I know where you weren't. Yeah, you were not. You were not where HD was, which
That's
is
right.
a
I'm,
sector in Canada. But you were there last year,
I was
so
there last
I
year.
don't feel too bad. I wasn't there either last year, so
I know you missed it last year. I
I
got to
know.
go. I'm really sad I missed it. It's really phenomenal community up there, and obviously Sector .ca. It's a security education conference in Canada, Toronto, Canada specifically. It's a Sector name. Now a Black Hat slash Informa event, and of course we love our friends at Black Hat and the community up in Toronto. It's phenomenal. When you say HD,
Yeah, this is my first time going back and since 2008, and it was kind of cool to see the same folks there. Brian and Bruce still introduced everybody, and
yeah,
it was great to see.
yeah, two good guys and a lot of good sessions, and they were smart to have you keynote this year, HD. Congratulations on that.
It was surprising. So they actually had accepted a talk that was completely different. That was a very nerdy session about SNMP. And then last minute, they're like, "Hey, do you mind doing a keynote instead?" And then I lost the next 2 weeks of my life to figuring out a keynote. So, but it came out okay.
Well, I think
um,
I think with your experience in the community and the industry, I'm sure it takes time to prepare it, but you're not certainly short of topics that you can talk about.
you've seen some things. You've seen
You've
There's
seen
that. If you've
things.
been in security more than 5 years, you definitely have all the war stories.
exactly, exactly. Well, for the folks wondering what it is we're doing here, so this is part of our event coverage for Sector 2025, and we've done a couple episodes with some folks, and we're thrilled to have HD on, one of the keynote speakers at the event, and we're going to hear all about what he spoke about at the event and what some of the feedback was from the community based on his talk, which is all about rules. I'm not going to say any more than that. But before we get into the nitty gritty that are rules, HD, maybe a few words about what you're up to at runZero and anything else you want to share before we get in.
Oh, sure. Still trying to build the best widget for exposure management. So both direct vulnerability detection, finding vulnerabilities that don't have CVEs, finding misconfigurations, and then doing, very broad top to bottom, inside out discovery and putting it all together. So that's kind of what I do all day is how do you take like all the different clues about what devices are in what part of your environment and use that to figure out where you're most at risk and then fix it.
Easy peasy, right?
That's right. Just the easy button for
Yeah. Well,
detection of all the stuff that we don't know about yet. Um, we had a great chat at Black Hat, and I would encourage everybody to listen to that because we talk a bit about what you just described. That's not what this is about. This is about rules, and in your abstract, um, you note one rule, and then we'll get into what this is all about. But change your passwords every month, right? And I presume you have some thoughts on if that's a good idea or a bad idea, or what, how does that really relate to what we're trying to accomplish in the grand scheme of things? Um, so the title of your session uh, was the once and future rules of cybersecurity. So you said you got the keynote invite and you put this together in a few weeks. What was the catalyst for this topic? Why did it come to the forefront?
Generally, keynotes, you hear a lot of like kind of grand ideas or how the world's changing, or these days you just hear people talk about AI. And I figured it'd be better to kind of go back a little bit and say, here's kind of how we got into security. Here's what we thought we were trying to do. Here's what actually happened. Here's what we're doing now. And just kind of contrast like what we previously took as givens in security versus where we are today in the world. And passwords are a good example of that, right? In the early 2000s, during my first pen test, we would tell customers, you need to rotate your password every 30 days and it has to be long, it has to be complicated. And if you write it down, we'll smack you on with a ruler and we'll look under your keyboard at night to see whether you've written it down on a post-it note, all that stuff. And what happened is that people just picked really bad passwords. Then they would do summer 2025 and autumn 2025 and summer 2025 one and summer 2025 two. And like basically, you can't expect people to be good random number generators all the time. And now if you look at what the recommended mechanisms are for password management, typically we're asking people to use password managers. What's more important, as opposed to rotating your password quickly, is just having a unique password per site and having a secure way to literally write it down. So we went from telling people that they had to change it all the time, never to write it down, to saying you must now write it down all the time, and then have a unique password per site that you never change.
So I have a question. I mean, and it's related to password because sometimes I tell the story on we used to have password back in the day just to enter in the in the castle, like the door is closed or the town walls are closed, and what's the password? And we're kind of like it's still already just to start a very old way to manage things. But my question for you is, for these kind of rules, and not specifically the password one, is it because they were kind of wrong to start with, even in 2000, looking back in retrospective, or is because the technology and the way we interact with the internet and the computer nowadays has changed? So was it like bad by default, or they become bad rules?
I think a little bit both. Where that rule came from about changing it all the time really had to do with expectations that people would share their passwords. Like kind of your password example, right? Everybody's the same password. You go to the castle, you say, here's the current password of the week of the day, but everyone knows the same password. And when you ask your coworkers to go log into a web portal, you say, what's the current password today to log into the portal? And so the idea was that everybody was sharing passwords back in the 90s and early 2000s. And the way to get around the issue of people sharing passwords was to force them to change it all the time, as opposed to guarantee every user had their own password. So once we changed the expectation that everybody had to have a unique password per human being, then the needing to change it all the time stopped becoming a requirement.
Now, when you define rules, the specific one around passwords is a rule, was a guideline. I think it was a recommendation that then later over time was retracted. To me, that's a policy that then turns into a control, right? Some technical control. How do you define rules in that regard, and what are, I don't know, how did you present that concept to folks
Well,
that
sure. I mean, we
not in your
certainly have,
business?
yeah, tons of policy. Like you can have a password policy, but the context of rules here is just what are the things that we all take for granted that we assume are the right way to do it. So if you walk into a building during your security training, what do they tell you to do on day one? Like, is that still true? How has it changed over time? So less so like the details of the policy, and more of just kind of like the common sense or quote unquote common sense mechanisms that we use to manage security in our daily lives and work.
And do you have some examples in the presentation about the good rules, the one that we can still consider pillars of the way we do cybersecurity?
Oh, for sure. I mean, what's, the interesting thing about passwords is the good part about passwords, we said you have to have a unique one per website. That's still a good rule. And we found out repeatedly as every website got compromised and you'd end up in these giant, password leak databases. People then do password stuffing attacks, then try your same password from site number one against site number two. Like that's actually been a really good rule. Having a unique password per portal you log into is still a great thing. Other rules we looked into were um, uh, let's see, trying to think of a good example of that. When you come up with a recovery mechanism, your recovery mechanism still has to be just as secure as your initial authentication. So if you have, a 2FA, for example, but your 2FA goes to an SMS line to a cell phone someplace, well, that's probably not good. It's probably less secure than your initial password was. So one of the early rules was whatever your recovery mechanism should also be just as strong as your initial authentication. Otherwise, attackers wouldn't go through the front door; they would just do a recovery process instead.
Were there any stories that you shared? I mean, like we were joking earlier. You've seen some things. When you were doing your keynote, did you share any stories with folks that piqued their interest, raised the hair on the back of their necks, or anything like that?
Sure. One funny one was around the passwords, right? I was doing a pen test for a credit union back in 2002, and the guy we're working with, his name was Dave, fantastic. He was the IT manager. He'd been there for 12 years. He'd worked his way up from the mailroom, kind of been the lowest person on the rung, all the way to the head of IT. And he was really excited to get the pen test. It was their first real security assessment. He just rolled out this policy that said people had to change passwords and was very excited to see like what would happen. So us being like cocky pen test people, we'd show up and we'd dump the SAM database and crack all the passwords. And the very first thing we notice is like hundreds of employees all have the same password of F Dave. Like it wasn't just that people had the idea. It's like, no, they got together and intentionally decided they were gonna have a password of F Dave because they were so mad about this policy. And Dave took it very personally. Like he was so mad about it. He was like literally in tears on day two. And he actually quit his job after the assessment was done because of that.
Wow.
It just pulled the rug out his entire worldview and how he worked with his coworkers. And the only silver lining in that story is we ended up hiring at my job. So we ended up hiring Dave to come and join our company as customer success because he was such a great people person.
That's
I,
super
like,
cool.
I love it, and this goes a long way to go that during October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. it's not cybersecurity very popular topic, right? You bring it to the company, you're the department of no, or department of it's going to take me forever to do these things. I don't want to do it, and that's definitely that kind of culture that I don't know. Do you feel it is changing nowadays? Is technology helping to make it a little bit easier than what it used to be, or people understand that cybersecurity is part of being in an office?
I think folks understand it, but until it's really their problem, they don't care.
Right.
And we still have the same challenge of like every CISO job is a little bit like playing duck duck goose. Like you don't want to, or musical chairs. You don't want to be the last person sitting there when the breach comes in. And there's only so much you can influence as a CISO to prevent that from happening. Like so, your job is to accept the risk and then possibly be the scapegoat and hope it doesn't happen on your watch. And it is what it is. I mean, obviously, there's companies out there that really bring security as a core value and it's driven top down. Those are fantastic. Then you have other companies that are constantly being pulled in front of the Senate to talk about their latest giant data breach. And there's nothing that we're going to do differently that's going to prevent that from happening next year. I mean, that's just the way it is, right? It's never going to be worth the cost to really secure things to prevent that from happening. So instead, what we have now is every one of us has 15 different, credit monitorings in the background. Like we've overlapping credit monitoring programs across all of us now. We just kind of given up, right? I would say the OPM breach, for folks who aren't familiar, is probably the worst one in the history of the US. That's every single person who ever applied for a position of public trust or a clearance. Their entire life history was leaked in that breach. And you don't really need anything else at that point. Like if you have the OPM data leak, you have the detailed history of everybody's person who's ever worked anywhere in a sensitive position in the US all at once. And after that, kind of every other breach kind of pales in comparison in terms of the impact to, security services, defense, et cetera.
Do you think there's bad publicity for cybersecurity, because we always talk about the negative things when bad things happen, but people don't understand that there is, for breaches that happen, there is so many breaches that do not happen. So are we having a healthy dialogue with the communities?
That's a good point. You only hear about security when something wrong happens, right? You don't hear about all the things that didn't explode or that didn't
Nope,
happen in between. But we
never.
also take it for granted. But I mean, that's also kind of the point, right? If you're going to be able to
Yeah.
do business on the internet, you're required to take security seriously, you're required to do all these programs. And of course, you would only hear about it when it fails because that's you screwing up. Like what we assume that security will be a top line priority for every company we do business with. And we only really get upset when we find out that isn't true and it becomes something that affects us personally or otherwise impacts someone we care about. But it doesn't make it any better. And so you talk about security being the department of no's, and a lot of CISOs would like to say that, oh, we're security enablers. That's true. Like if it wasn't for security, you couldn't do anything at all at your job. You could not do online insurance. You couldn't do online e-commerce. But at the end of the day, you're still going to be a department of slow down, of no, of check the boxes, of follow our policy, of accept the risk, et cetera. Like there's no way around that, right? You need somebody to be the person who's going to raise their hand and say, hang on a second here, let's make sure we're doing this correctly.
I'm wondering, because I had a conversation the other day about we overcomplicate things to some degree, and some rules sound good and may reduce the risk a lot, and therefore it's a good idea to implement a rule to help protect the business. But then it's just not feasible. And I'm looking at back to kind of this access, maybe not necessarily passwords, but access control and PKI. Great idea, hard to implement, expensive to maintain, has its own flaws if you start storing your keys in public public domain. So, are there rules like that where we just haven't seen adoption? So they're good ideas, but not really feasible in terms of adoption that still exist, or maybe we should look at a little more closely and learn from.
I think example where we're finally starting to cross that line from something that would, what we want it to work, how we want it to work versus how it actually works is around passkeys and hardware tokens. We've gotten to the point now that like instead of having to remember your password manager, you literally just open up your phone, do a biometric thing, and then it unlocks the website. And the authentication sequence you're doing with unlocking your phone may not be the most secure thing in the world, but the device, the authentication material, the key material lives inside of a hardware enclave in your phone, and that actually is protected. And depending on your enclave, it could be secure, like in the case of an iPhone, or terrible, like in the case of BitLocker, as we saw with repeated attacks against BitLocker. Like if you don't have a pin on your BitLocker, it's bad news. You still have to call it data loss if you lose your laptop because of the weaknesses there. So we're getting there. I feel like passkeys are a good example of where we're able to actually simplify authentication and get to the point where users have strong authentication everywhere. And then that's only as secure as the enclave or the OS protection, of course, for the passkey. But we're getting there, where I think there's other cases where we're just not going to get to. Like if you want to, let's say, store your information online in a way that no one else can access, good luck. Like no cloud provider is actually going to encrypt your data at a per row level. They're not going to be able to do half the work they want to do. We talk about things like homomorphic encryption, where your cloud provider can't see what you're doing with your data, and yet it's not really worth the cost to do that yet. So we're a long way from being able to do real private computing. As much as we talk about things like SGX and trusted execution and things like that, like the whole Apple private computing cloud, all that really depends on the hardware being secure. And there are some really neat attacks that came out in the last week or so of doing direct attacks on the RAM sticks themselves, basically creating like an interposer of the memory stick and using that to basically leak crypto keys and decrypt and so on. So the short version of that is like we spent all this effort trying to create these like private compute clouds and trusted computing, only for somebody with a $50 bit of kit to be able to break into your server and steal the password anyways. So what does it actually matter?
Interesting. And what were some of the? I know somebody like you must have a lot of people come up to the stage and want to talk to you, and obviously you had a booth at Sector as well. So I presume a number of folks came by and talked to you at the booth. What was some of the feedback or follow up questions that people had after you shared some of these things?
One of the examples I've provided is that we talk about the network perimeter being this kind of like hard, crunchy outside and soft, chewy inside. That's what the old security model was. And supposedly we've made it better. We've now made it so you've got Beyond Corp and zero trust and all this kind of fun stuff. But we really haven't solved the problem. We still have networks full of IoT devices. We still have firewalls that have gone from being the thing that we depend on to protect our networks to now being the number one way into the network. So I think a really funny stat there is Mandiant has this breach report that I put out once a year, and the top 4 initial access vectors for 2024 were all security products. There are people getting compromised through their Palo Alto firewall, through their Ivanti endpoint manager, and then through their Fortinet appliances. So we've went from these products being what people bought to secure the networks, these products now being how they get compromised. And calling that out, I think, was something that a lot of folks are not really willing to say publicly. And I think it makes a lot of sense to say, no, like these products actually are the worst thing going on for security right now is your firewall. Like you're paying money to a quote unquote security company to then get breached by vulnerabilities that shouldn't be present in those products that should have been fixed decades ago based on the type of flaws we're seeing. So a lot of folks can reach out saying, wow, I'm glad you called out these vendors for doing all these shady things and causing more problems than they solve. And also thank you for not talking about AI. Those are the 2 big things that stood out.
So you don't want to talk about AI. That's what you're
You
saying.
can, but there's enough people talking about AI. I don't think we need to.
I know. I was just making a joke, but I do want to talk about as we wrap this about the future a little bit. So we talked about maybe the rules that are worth to keep, the rules that are need to be trusted and don't even look back. Do you think there, with the change again of technology, and sorry, I'm going to have to say AI and all of that, do you think, what kind of rule do you think we will have in the future that will be necessary to add to the arsenal?
I mean, the one that's still true so far is like segmentation is still a thing that we aren't doing very well. Like whenever you have devices that have shared trust and you have to put them all in one spot, like you have to put all your IoT or OT equipment in the factory on the same network because it has to work together. Like you have to put that off in its own segment, you need to isolate it, you need to monitor it. You have the same problem now happening with AI and with data. Like you see the various prompt injection attacks are kind of endemic. Like there's no real way to fix them. That's just how this technology works. It's like trying to prevent cross-site scripting inside of JavaScript in your browser. It's like, no, that's literally how the technology works. There's no such thing as injection. It's all injection, right? So if you talk about doing agentic AI flows and how you're pulling data from different sources and pulling those into your queries and whatnot, by definition, it's vulnerable to attack. It's going to be vulnerable to somebody manipulating a response and then causing it to then redirect your instructions to something else. So kind of as a technology, AI and agentic flows are fundamentally broken at this point. There's no way to separate your data layer from your control layer until we fix that. We're just going to go repeat all the same problems we had with cross-site scripting and SQL injection all over again.
At scale, because we put it in the hands of everybody. I'm going to ask this future question. And do we need to rethink the way we think of rules? Because the examples we've given are we have technology, we use passwords to grant access, and then we write a rule around that. So what's the rule? Change your password every 30 days, or use a password manager. And I'm wondering, are we missing the point of the rule by asking it from a technical perspective? Or does the future hold a rethink of how we ask that question and answer that question for rules?
That's a good point. A lot of what we do around like network segmentation is because we have to, because the network side is just really fragile and there's no authentication. And if we didn't have that problem to start with, we wouldn't have to worry about doing the segmentation in the first place. So could we redesign our network stacks or administration protocols or something else to get there? It's one of the things I'm excited about with like passkeys is that we're finally moving from like a secret that you have to keep in your brain to a secret that's actually stored in the hardware that you're kind of unlocking on the fly. And so you can have some of the HSMs that are out there, the hardware storage modules for serious crypto keys, they only have a 4-digit password, and that's okay. Like it's amazing that you can actually have a really important secret protected only by a 4-digit code, and that being a totally reasonable way to defend something, as long as your hardware is secure enough to prevent brute force attacks. Or if you guess more than 3 pins in a row, like it wipes the machine, right? That's our way of solving those problems. So we're starting to finally change the rules a little bit by kind of moving the attack vectors, by having stronger kind of built-in security. And it took us a long time for the technology to catch up before that was actually a thing. For the last 20 years, whenever somebody said, "Oh, my hard drive will auto unlock," it's like, great, well, give me 20 minutes and a debugger and a JTAG cable, and now it's unlocked anyways, right? So it took a while for us to kind of like deliver the security we've been promising in a bunch of areas to be able to change those base levels of technology. But I think you're right. Like things like passwords, maybe we shouldn't have them anymore. Maybe there should be something else, like identity keys, authenticate, like crypto tokens for everything. Same thing with like network access. Maybe we just don't have web-based management anymore for network devices. Maybe we can put a different way to do it.
Yeah. And you mentioned zero trust earlier. Maybe we have to accept that OPM is reality, right? Everything is exposed, and assumed breached or assume accessed, and act accordingly. And I'm just thinking of recovery, right? You talk about 3 password attempts and you wipe the machine. Well, that's only good if you have a way to recover. If it's
and somebody else can't trigger those 3 attempts.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, the only thing I can think about is the first rule of cybersecurity is that you don't talk about cybersecurity.
And don't plug it in. And
that was
the
Fight Club, right? That was a Fight Club. I'm sorry. It was fun.
It's always fascinating chatting with you, HD.
Spark out the Sean.
Yep. Good stuff, and glad you had a chance to connect with the folks in Toronto at Sector. I presume folks who registered and attended have a way to connect to your presentation at some point, and hopefully do that. And if you make that public, let us know. We'll share that with folks as well. Until then, everybody should just connect with you and ask their questions directly. And HD, thanks for sharing your story with us about your keynote at Sector. Hope to see you at another event soon, or tell another runZero story as well. And thanks everybody for listening and watching to this conversation with Sean and Marco as we continue to cover events all around the world.
Thank you.